everyone. My name is Ian Miller, and I'm here today to talk with Virginia Senator Jennifer McClellan, Democratic candidate for governor of Virginia. I attended public schools in and around Richmond, Virginia, and I'm a member of the anti-racist alumni of Maggie Walker Governor's School. Today, Senator McClellan and I will be discussing ending modern-day school segregation. First, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors who bring me this interview series. The Ending Modern Day School Segregation series is a collaborative effort on nonprofits who decided to partner in support of their joint mission for education equity throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. This series is brought to you by the anti-racist alumni of Maggie Walker Governor's School, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, or AAJC, CASA in Action, Christopher Newport University's Center for Education Research and Policy, Lewis Academy Now, the Chesterfield County branch of the NAACP, the Fairfax County branch of the NAACP, NACASEC Action Fund, the Proudly Diverse Caucus, and the Thomas Jefferson Alumni Action Group. The topic of this series is ending modern-day school segregation. Historically, Virginia has taken extreme measures to maintain racial segregation in its schools. At the height of the civil rights movement, the state closed schools and even entire districts in order to avoid racial integration. Around the same time, Virginia even created 20 segregation academies, which were private schools that remained whites only until they were found also to be unconstitutional in 1976. Despite the US Supreme Court ruling that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional in 1954, our education system today perpetuates racial inequality. We largely fund public schools with property taxes, and because most school districts are racially concentrated, Virginia's mostly white affluent school districts have greater resources than their poorer districts that mostly serve students of color. At the national level, a 2019 report by EdBuild found that mostly white public schools receive about $23 billion more in annual funding than schools with mostly non-white students, despite serving about the same number of students. Additionally, within the classroom today, Virginia continues to face racial gaps in educational achievement, disciplinary action disproportionately taken against non-white students, and an unequal impact of the COVID-19 pandemic against students of color. These topics and how we should address them are at the heart of our discussion today. And now I'd like to introduce our guest at this time. Virginia State Senator Jennifer McClellan serves the 9th District on behalf of the Democratic Party since 2017, and she is vice chair of the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus. She is the daughter of a third-generation educator and has worked extensively on education policy. She is also a mother of 2 children in the Richmond Public Schools. Welcome, Senator. How are you this afternoon?
I'm great, Ian. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. I'd like to start with a framing question, if I could. The main topic we're discussing is ending modern-day school segregation. Can you describe what that topic means to you personally?
Sure. I think of, as a lawyer, the first thing that comes to mind is the phrase de facto segregation. As we all know, legally, segregation ended in 1954, but what that didn't come with a magic wand that undid the effects of really centuries of segregation policy and segregation laws, and especially when you add on top of that the results of massive resistance. So when I think of modern day segregation, I think of the lingering impact that legal segregation had on communities that remain segregated, and then on schools that also remain segregated because those communities remain segregated. And I'm sure we'll talk about in our discussion tonight that it was much more than just laws expressly requiring schools to be segregated that led to segregated communities. And again, we all have to intentionally work to undo the legacy of those laws and policies to undo the impacts that still affect our communities today.
Thank you for that. You mentioned massive resistance, and I don't have any recollection in my public school curriculum that instance of that particular term. On that topic, one of the purposes of teaching students history is to ensure that we learn from past events and improve society in the future. How would you encourage educators to lead conversations with their students as it relates to race and school segregation?
Great question, Ian. And you're right. We didn't, I graduated from high school in 1990. We didn't learn about massive resistance. We did learn about Brown versus Board of Education. We didn't even learn about the beginning of public education in Virginia and the beginning of segregation, which happened first during Reconstruction, was public schools starting, and then integration beginning at the end of Reconstruction as a response to that. So it is very important that we teach this history, not just in school. And to do it in school, we need to make sure our history, our social studies, our civics lessons tell a complete and accurate history of our Commonwealth and our country. But there are a lot of people who were born after Jim Crow legally ended who don't know that history either. And we've got to teach them. And so we have to use public history to make sure we are teaching that, whether it is the work that I have done through the state's Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Commission, whether it is commemorations that we have, museums, our state library, monuments. We have to be sure we are using all of our public spaces, our public history resources to teach adults who still need to learn this history as well.
Very good. I understand that you have passed legislation focused on early childhood education and that you plan on providing universal child care and early learning programs. How do these programs relate to the goal of ending modern day school segregation?
So the equity gap does not begin in kindergarten. It begins at birth. It begins, and to tell that story, you mentioned in the intro, I have two kids in Richmond Public Schools. One is a fifth grader, one is a kindergartner. And I remember when my son, my now fifth grader, started, his teacher had been teaching for 20 years and told me that the biggest change she saw is kindergarten is now all academic. It used to be where the soft skills were taught. She can tell on day one which children have had formal early childhood education, some formal early development, and which ones haven't. For a wide variety of reasons, it tends to be disproportionately children of color who do not have access to childcare and do not have access to early learning. And so that equity gap is already there by the time they come to kindergarten. By having universal childcare, and when I use childcare and early childhood development education interchangeably, because even at infant care, you begin brain development. Mm-hmm. By having universal childcare and early learning, you close that gap before kids ever come to school. And as we expand access to childcare, we have to expand access to providers, making sure we have providers in every community, making sure we have an educator workforce that reflects the diversity of the students that they have and the children they have are critically important parts of that plan.
Gotcha. On the topic of your children and your personal experience with public schools, can you talk about what we might say to families who might be considering sending their kids to a private school to persuade them that choosing public school might be a tool for ending modern day segregation?
You know, you're part of how we ended up with de facto segregation. You touched on it in your intro. Was these private academies and white flight. When schools were integrated legally, many families fled to the suburbs or fled the public school system to begin with. And that began modern day segregation. So it is critically important that both for the purpose of keeping schools integrated, but keeping our public schools strong, having more people in the public school system is critically important. And I think and another way I can use my platform, both as a senator and hopefully as governor, is by encouraging parents to stay in the public schools. Gotcha.
Related to that a bit, how might we recruit? Like another part of integration, I think, is recruiting a more diverse talent pool on the faculty side. What ideas do you have for recruiting more diverse teachers and other faculty members into schools?
So there was a study done at the state level a few years ago to answer that very question. And it looked at what were some of the barriers to people of color entering the workforce. And it was a wide variety of things, from the praxis exam that is used to help teachers get their license, or you have to pass the praxis exam to get a license. There are many questions around whether there's implicit bias in the praxis exam. There were recommendations around really targeting and focusing on the teacher prep programs at HBCUs to really beef those programs up and build relationships between those HBCUs and school divisions across the Commonwealth, because those HBCUs tend to be concentrated or are concentrated in the Richmond and Hampton Roads area. So building those relationships. There were many more recommendations, some of which we began to implement, but we need to focus on implementing all of them. And then through the G3 program that the General Assembly just passed, I think we can also, for early childhood education, it provides free community college for teachers who will focus on, or students who will commit to certain high need programs, including early learning. And so really using that to encourage those students when they graduate to go into school divisions and areas that need a more diverse workforce.
Very good. What are some, on a, maybe hopefully a more brighter note, what are some of the examples that you've seen across the state where schools or school districts or cities are getting it right, where they're actually making progress toward meaningful racial integration?
That's an interesting question. I haven't, it's more anecdotal than data.
Yeah.
And it's over time. So quick story. I grew up in Chesterfield County, went to Matoaka High School. Matoaka High School was the first integrated high school when it was built. And when I was in school was pretty well integrated. It was, 50-50 white and black, not very many of anything else. So overall, it was not particularly diverse, but at least from the way most people, it was about 50-50 white and black. Every other school in Chesterfield County, predominantly white. And I remember when I would visit Byrd High School or Midlothian, they were like, I think 90% white. When my nephew graduated from Midlothian High School 3 years ago, and I went to speak at his senior convocation, and I looked in the audience, it was slightly more than 50-50. So I think there have been some changes that are basically demographics based, just as certain communities become more integrated, their schools become more integrated. And I think that's part of this conversation we cannot forget. We cannot adequately integrate our schools if we are not focusing on integrating communities. And there are lots of structural reasons, there are lots of historic reasons why communities remain segregated. And so we've got to tackle these issues together.
Yeah, that's a perfect lead in for my next question. And this gets more at some of the legal obstacles to doing things just at the school level. So Milliken versus Bradley creates, major roadblocks for states that want to take intentional action for racial integration in the schools. It prevents things like busing and combining school districts, which are seen by a lot of people as effective ways to promote racial integration. How would you, as governor, try to deal with legal barriers like this in your efforts to end modern day school segregation?
Yeah, great question. And I work very closely with both the state attorney general's office and the U.S. Department of Justice on that very question. But I think, again, we have got to be focusing on making sure we are removing barriers to integrating communities so that when the communities are more integrated, it will help integrate those schools. Some of that has to do with, you still have neighborhoods where there are racial covenants in their deeds that even though they're not legally binding, they're still there. There are still communities that have a very difficult time, Black communities and that have a difficult time getting mortgages, getting loans, having access to affordable housing in certain areas. There are still communities that will not accept housing vouchers, that will not accept certain sources of income for renters in those areas. We have focused on trying to expand affordable housing tax credits for landlords or developers who will focus on building affordable housing in higher income communities, because income has become a proxy for race in a lot of areas. And again, that's connected to how so many jobs that at one time were only available to people of color were low wage jobs. And now when you look at who has minimum wage jobs, who has low wage jobs, it is predominantly people of color, predominantly women of color. And again, we've got to tackle inequity in our economic system, in our housing system, our transportation system, where we had highways that cut off neighborhoods from everything else, and you don't have good, reliable public transportation to help people get to work. So we've got to tackle this holistically, and not just, you can't completely integrate schools if you're not looking at how do we integrate our communities and help people migrate into areas that they can integrate.
Yeah, that makes sense. Everything's connected. The schools don't live in a vacuum. When talking about, getting back specifically to schools though, when talking about modern day school segregation, the debate seems to get stuck on having to make this choice between maintaining really high standards, whether it be standardized test scores, graduation rates, whatever metric you want to pick, versus creating a more diverse, inclusive, equitable school system. What are your thoughts on whether this is a real tension, you can't have both, versus this being a false choice?
In a lot of ways, I think it's a false choice, because it's what are you focusing your attention on? So 2 points. You have got to structurally tackle things at the beginning of the system. You cannot just say we're going to change the standards to get into high school and not address, that's treating the symptom. That is not treating the underlying disease. And the underlying disease is our entire system from the beginning creates and exacerbates inequity. So by restructuring the system, the curriculum, our how we invest our money in the education system at the front end, that will trickle through to who is getting into what high schools, or how are you doing in high school. So that's, you have to do that. That's part of it. I challenge the notion that you have to lower standards related to test scores, because test scores, in many cases, and there are many studies that show this, do not actually measure what a student knows or how smart they are. Again, I see that with my own son, who does not test well, but that is not a reflection of how well he reads or how well he does math. And so I think we have to really critically look at what are we testing, and what are the standards, and what are they actually measuring? And that has to be part of this conversation as well.
Gotcha. Some of the organizations co-hosting this series do work on equity and gifted education. I'd mentioned I was a graduate of the Maggie Walker Governor's School, which was one of the magnet schools in Richmond. What are your thoughts on gifted education as part of the larger debate on modern day school segregation?
I benefited from gifted education in Chesterfield. I was identified very young as gifted and placed in gifted classes. The problem is we have many school divisions that's not an option for kids at all, and those are school divisions that happen to be predominantly Black or predominantly non-white. And so when looking at the gifted program, you have to make sure it's equitably accessible. And that is one of the reasons why we have to address, going back to my earlier answer of addressing the underlying disease. If a student can't take an AP class, or if a student can't take an honors class that would help get them into a magnet school or a governor's school, they're at a disadvantage from day one. And we've got to be sure we are giving all of our students the option to be tested. There are many school divisions, there are many families, they don't even know how to get their kids tested to see if they're gifted. So we've got to make sure we are expanding the accessibility of gifted programs to everyone, and not just the select few.
What form do you think that takes? Is that additional regulation to create more of a level playing field so that every school has the same accessibility to these programs, or what's the tactical piece of that?
Part of it's money. The reason those school divisions don't have gifted programs in some cases is frankly they can't afford them, or and you cannot have a conversation about equity in education that doesn't talk about how we fund our education system. We fund our education system based primarily on local government property taxes. We have what's called a local composite index, which is a formula created in the 70s, that says for every local government, based on their sources of income, which are property taxes primarily, what percentage of their K-12 system can they pay for, spits out a number, and then the state pays the rest. That formula doesn't account for what else do they have to pay for. Do they have high concentrations of students with poverty? Do they have high concentrations of students that face trauma? So from the beginning, you have unequal systems. And then short term, the state can make up for that through targeted investments in those communities that may have those high concentrations of poverty, high concentrations of trauma, to help bridge the gap, to allow them to have programs that identify and provide, advanced opportunities. That's a longer term solution. Shorter term, I think we really need to focus on regional solutions. Once we continue, we need to continue to close the digital divide, but making use of virtual solutions could help as well. But I think we've got to think outside of the box a little bit to say, if we just say to every school division, you have to have a gifted program, but we're not giving them the resources to do it, we're setting them up to fail.
Gotcha. On that same topic of funding, as it relates to school equity, the podcast Nice White Parents, which I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to that or not, concludes with this recommendation that funding for PTAs be pooled and evenly distributed to all schools within a school district. What are your thoughts on this approach versus other ideas you might have to ensure equity in educational resources?
I think that's an excellent idea. And again, when Jack started school, and I went to my first PTA meeting at Fox Elementary, I was a little bit intimidated. And they had a 6-figure budget. Their schools in the district, in my house district, their schools less than 2 miles away from each other that barely have a PTA. And I saw that made a difference because there's certain things that the school division wasn't paying for that the PTA picked it up. So Fox Elementary got a salad bar because the PTA paid for it. Now, eventually, once there was a grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the state, other schools were able to get a salad bar. But again, the point of a public school system is supposed to be your quality of education doesn't depend on your neighborhood or your zip code. And so where you have inequities like that, I think it is up to the public school system. And when I say the public school system, I really mean not just the local division, but the state board of education and the federal government to help bridge those gaps. So I'm all for any creative way to make sure we are helping bridge those gaps.
Still on that same topic of funding, there's federal legislation, I think, that seeks to provide financial incentives to support school districts with projects that are specifically focused on improving diversity. If you were governor, how might you try to help schools and school districts take advantage of such incentives?
Well, first, help them know that they're there, and help to advocate on that they apply for those incentives, and then advocate with the federal government that they be awarded them. I think we have to make sure that the local, state, and federal government officials are partnering much more than we do on meeting all of our education needs. Sometimes at the state level, we treat local school divisions and local governments as just one other advocacy group that we have to listen to, not as a partner that we have to work with to meet the educational needs of our students.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. In terms of immediate action, let's say you are elected governor of Virginia in November, take office in January 2022. What are some of the first, maybe the first two education-related policy initiatives you want to tackle?
So the funding that we just talked about, I would, the first thing I'm going to do as governor is present budget amendments to the outgoing governor's budget. And I will fully implement and fund the Board of Education's recommended standards of quality. This is something I've been trying to do for the past 2 years. It includes an equity fund. It includes the, and tied into that, I would lift the cap that the state pays for support personnel that would get counselors, mental health professionals, nurses in our schools at the recommended ratios that the Board of Ed has. That's short term. And then I would focus on my universal early childhood plan. I would focus on making sure our curriculum is including that full and complete and accurate history that we need to be teaching, that we would restructure the curriculum to make sure that we are teaching our students the skills they need as a 21st century graduate from kindergarten to 12th grade. Longer term, I would focus on restructuring how we fund K-12 so that it is not based on the local composite index and primarily local property taxes, but that's going to probably take a couple of years before I can get that in place.
Gotcha. As it relates to private education or homeschooling, like what would you say that the public school education system's purpose is? Like what is that gap that it fills versus if everything was private or homeschool?
So if you go back to how it was started, and this was something I didn't learn until I was a member of the General Assembly. In the wake of the Civil War, as you had formerly enslaved people coming into public service and serving in the General Assembly and serving in the Constitutional Convention, there was this alliance between them and sort of the non-power landed gentry pre-Civil War to create a system of public education that was supposed to be the great leveler. It was supposed to be the key to economic opportunity for everyone. It was supposed to be the key to thriving, healthy communities. And frankly, it was supposed to be the key to a thriving, healthy democracy. That was the point. So that you didn't have a system of haves and have-nots, and the haves got an education and the have-nots didn't. To me, that is the point of a public education today. And our number one priority as government needs to be to strengthen, improve, and have the best public education for everyone that we can.
Gotcha. You've served, as I mentioned, quite a few years in the Virginia legislature. What is it about becoming governor of Virginia that feels necessary to you? What could you do as governor, especially as it relates to ending modern day school segregation, that makes an impact that you just can't have as a legislator?
The governor sets the agenda, and the budget is the primary way. The budget, the appointments process, who's in my cabinet, who's my Secretary of Education, who is on the Board of Education, who is on all the boards and commissions that touch on these issues. When the governor makes something a priority, it is much more likely to happen. And that's why I've put in budget amendments to lift the cap on support personnel since I think, at least 2017, if not before. I can't get it done through that budget amendment. I put in bills to fully implement the standards of quality, at least 2 years, can't get it done. So, but when the governor puts it in, it's more likely to stay. It's also the governor has a much higher bully pulpit and stage and platform to use to tell a complete history, to elevate this issue. And to focus people's attention on things they may not have thought about. Because the one thing I've noticed is everyone's political views, their personal views, their policy views are shaped by their life experiences and what experiences they've been exposed to. I bring a different perspective to the governor's mansion as someone whose great-grandparents founded a Rosewood school in Alabama to teach Black children because the state of Alabama wouldn't do it. As the daughter of a woman who was 12 of 14 children in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi and was the first member of her family to go beyond the 8th grade because the Catholic Church was the only school for Black children and it only went to the 8th grade, and what that meant for them. No other governor has ever had that perspective. And while I've told those stories in the House and the Senate, telling those stories on a much broader scale to help people see this is how policy decisions and things that have happened in our past still affect us today and our communities today. And that is a conversation we are at a critical crossroads that we have to have if we are ever going to address inequity and segregation in our schools and in our communities.
Gotcha. Last question for you. You've talked a bit about housing and transportation and all these other aspects that are connected to providing a quality education. What are some of the most pivotal aspects that build strong communities that you'd like to lead Virginia to focus on as governor to help bring equity to our public school system?
I think part of it is also, the next governor is going to have to lead a recovery out of 4 crises that are happening right now: health pandemic, economic crisis, a reckoning with racial injustice, and a growing loss of faith that people have in government's ability to solve problems. And so it is critically economic recovery, healthcare, the recovery of our healthcare system, and rebuilding our education system and helping to identify where our students are, meet them where they are, and recognize when they come back in the fall, and probably and hopefully everyone will be in the building, they're not going to be where they're supposed to be. My son going in the 6th grade, it's going to be a very different experience than had COVID not happened. Many of our students are going to come in with trauma. The equity gap now is not just based on your neighborhood. In some cases, it's based on your household. And so making sure that we are building an economic recovery that helps those parents get back to work in an equitable way, that helps make sure they're being paid wages that meet their needs, that those students that are living in food deserts are eating, because you can't learn if you're hungry, that if they have health needs, especially mental health needs, those needs are being met, because you can't learn if your health needs aren't being met, that they're living in housing that is not falling apart, and that they're not worried about, that they have housing security, because you can't learn if you're worried about, am I going to be living on the street tomorrow? That is what the next governor is going to need to focus on, and how all these issues are interconnected, and breaking down silos between different agencies and different, secretariats that impact what happens to these students and what happens to these kids, because everything that happens to them at home, they bring in the building. And so we've got to address their holistic needs, not just their educational needs, if they're going to learn.
Thank you. So that about wraps up our questions today. Thank you so much, Virginia Senator McClellan. We really appreciate taking the time for this interview today. And I want to wish you well on your campaign for Virginia governor.
Thank you, Ian.
My pleasure.
Have a great night.
You too. I want to thank all of our audience who tuned in live to listen to this chat. It will be recorded and available later. I also want to thank all of our sponsors, and I especially want to thank our guest, Virginia Senator McClellan, for joining us here today to talk about, and for her for sharing our positions on these complex, multifaceted, and vitally important subjects around ending modern day school segregation. This interview is a part of a series, and we encourage you to check out all the interviews with all candidates for governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general by visiting tjaag.org/emdss-library. This concludes our webinar. Thank you.